There was no way for Manila to dodge this one. The storm, the Philippines calls Kiyapo, never touched the capital, and it hurt it anyway, raking the far north of Luzon with winds of 85 kilometres per hour, while pulling the monsoon straight over Manila. And it is not finished. It is now feeding over the South China Sea, forecast to become a typhoon and strike the Guangdong coast this weekend. Stay with me, and you will see exactly what is coming. A tropical storm that most of the world had not heard of on Thursday is now the system that 5 weather agencies across the Asia-Pacific are tracking at the same moment. Its international name is Noul. Inside the Philippines, it is called Kiyapo. And on Friday the 24th of July, it did something storms are not supposed to do. It crossed a chain of islands and came out stronger. Early on Friday, it was a modest system in the Philippine Sea, roughly 600 kilometres northeast of Manila, with sustained winds near 65 kilometres per hour. By Friday afternoon, after making landfall over the far north of Luzon, the Philippine Weather Service, PAGASA, put its sustained winds at 85 kilometres per hour, with gusts reaching 115, still moving west-northwest at 30 kilometres per hour. A storm that gains strength while it is scraping over land is a storm that has found very warm water and very little to slow it down, and that is exactly the environment waiting for it next. Here is why this reaches far beyond the islands it just crossed. Kiyapo is not stopping in the Philippines. It is heading for the southern coast of China, and the forecasters in Manila, Taipei, Tokyo, Hong Kong and Beijing all agree on the shape of the next 2 days. This storm moves out over the northern South China Sea, and it is expected to become a full typhoon before it makes landfall this weekend on one of the most crowded coastlines on the planet. The Hong Kong Observatory already had its first tropical cyclone signal flying on Friday evening, with the storm still 800 kilometres away. By the end of this bulletin, you will know exactly where Kiyapo is going, why the forecasters disagree about how strong it becomes, and which coastline has the most to lose. Kiyapo made its Philippine landfall on Friday afternoon over Camiguin Island in Cagayan, part of the Babuyan Islands off the northern tip of Cagayan province. These are the islands at the very top of Luzon, where the Philippine landmass breaks apart into the Luzon Strait, and they took the storm's centre first. PAGASA raised tropical cyclone wind signal number 2 over Batanes, the Babuyan Islands, the northern towns of mainland Cagayan, and Pagudpud in Ilocos Norte. Earlier in the day, signal number 1 had been up across 13 areas as the storm approached. Signal number 2 means winds strong enough to damage light structures, tear off weak roofing, and bring down branches and unstable trees. For these small island communities, sitting directly under the track, it is the most serious warning on the board. The sea was the immediate danger. PAGASA forecast very rough seas building to 5.5 metres along the seaboards of Batanes and the Babuyan Islands, and to 4.5 metres along the northern coasts of mainland Cagayan and Ilocos Norte. Waves of that size around small islands with limited harbours are a direct threat to fishing communities and to the ferries that are their only link to the mainland, which is why the warnings went up before the winds peaked. In this part of the world, a storm signal is not a weather comment. It is an instruction, and the people of Batanes and the Babuyans have seen enough of these to act on it fast. There was one piece of good news in the timing. PAGASA said Kiyapo would move quickly, exiting the Philippine area of responsibility overnight into Saturday, which limits how long any single island sits under the worst of the wind. A fast-moving storm dumps less rain on any one place than a slow one. But speed cuts both ways here, because the same quick motion that spared the islands a longer battering is now carrying the storm toward China faster than a weaker system would travel, and giving it a clean, uninterrupted run across the warmest water on its route. The strange thing about Kiyapo is that most of the Filipinos affected by it never saw its center at all. While the far north took the wind, the storm's circulation reached down and pulled the southwest monsoon, the habagat, across the western side of Luzon. That monsoon flow is what turns a northern storm into a nationwide rain event. As Kiyapo tracked along the top of the country, its outer winds dragged moisture-loaded air off the South China Sea and drove it into the mountains of western Luzon, enhancing rainfall over provinces hundreds of kilometres from the eye, including around Metro Manila. So the same storm produced two separate emergencies at once: a wind and sea event for the far northern islands and a monsoon rain event for the crowded capital belt to the south. This is a pattern the Philippines knows painfully well, and it is one of the reasons storms here stay dangerous even when they are not direct hits. A city does not need the eye to flood. It needs the storm to switch on the monsoon. And Kiyapo did exactly that as it passed. Manila has drowned before understorms whose centres never came close. When the habagat turned ordinary afternoon downpours into days of flooding that shut roads, stranded commuters, and pushed rivers over their banks. For anyone in the low-lying western Luzon provinces, the threat on Friday and into the weekend was never the storm's wind. It was the water the storm was steering onto them from the sea. That split personality is the first thing that makes Kiyapo worth watching closely. A storm that can wound the far north with wind and soak the capital with rain in the same afternoon, all while getting stronger, is a storm with more than one way to hurt people. And it was only getting started because the part of its life that threatens the largest number of people was still ahead of it, out over open water. By late Friday, Kiyapo had done what PAGASA said it would. It began pulling away from the Philippines and out over open water, leaving the Philippine area of responsibility overnight into Saturday. Now the storm enters the stretch that worries forecasters the most. Ahead of it lies the northern South China Sea, warm, open, and, in this El Niño season, loaded with ocean heat. Every major agency tracking the system expects the same outcome. Kiyapo intensifies over that water and reaches typhoon strength before it strikes the southern China coast this weekend. The northern South China Sea in late July is a reservoir of stored summer heat, and a storm moving into it under light overhead winds has been handed the two ingredients it needs to strengthen: warm water below and calm air above. That is the setup ahead of Kiyapo right now. Taiwan felt the first edge of the turn. The Central Weather Administration in Taipei issued a sea warning on Friday as the storm passed to the island's south, roughly 530 kilometres southeast of Taiwan's southernmost point. Taiwan is not in line for a landfall this time, but the swell and the squally outer rain bands reach far beyond the centre, and the sea warning is the agency telling shipping and fishing crews to clear the water while they still can. A storm does not have to hit you to kill you at sea, and the waters between the Philippines, Taiwan, and the Chinese coast are some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. From there, the road runs west-northwest, straight toward the Guangdong coast and the enormous cluster of cities packed behind it. This is the moment the story stops being a Philippine story and becomes a regional one. The same storm that raked a few thousand islanders in the far north is now pointed at a coastline where tens of millions of people live within reach of the sea, and the only real questions left are how strong Kiyapo gets and precisely where it comes ashore. Here is where the story turns genuinely tense, because the agencies do not agree on how bad this gets. On intensity, the official forecasts span a wide range. Guidance aligned with the Japan Meteorological Agency puts Kiyapo's peak near 60 knots, about 110 kilometres per hour, with a central pressure around 980 hectopascals as it reaches the coast. The American Joint Typhoon Warning Center goes higher to around 80 knots, roughly 150 kilometres per hour, with offshore waves building to 8.5 metres. That gap, 60 knots against 80, is the difference between a strong tropical storm and a solid typhoon, and it comes down to a single variable: how much of the ocean's heat the storm manages to convert before the coast shuts it off. The track disagreement matters just as much. The most likely scenario from the Hong Kong Observatory brings the centre ashore on the eastern Guangdong coast, between Huizhou and Jieyang, early on Sunday the 26th. Other guidance shifts the landfall along the coast in either direction, anywhere from Zhuhai, right at the mouth of the Pearl River, up to Jiangpu in Fujian province. When the models split, they tell you something specific. The American model has been placing the core within about 45 kilometres of Hong Kong, while the European model tracks it roughly 180 kilometres further east. Read those two ends together, and you get the real picture. The single most likely landfall is east of the Pearl River Delta, but the delta itself, and Hong Kong with it, sits on the western, closer to the centre side of the forecast cone. That is the worst place to be on a forecast map. It means the biggest population in the region is not the bullseye, but it is well within range if the storm tracks even a little west of the current best guess. Forecasters call this the dangerous side of the cone for a reason. A shift of 50 or 60 kilometres in the track, well inside the normal margin of error 2 days out, is the difference between the Pearl River Delta getting the weaker left flank of the storm and getting the stronger right side, where the winds and the storm surge are always worst. Nobody along that coast can rule themselves out yet, and that uncertainty is the whole reason the warnings are already going up. 2 days is very little time and just enough time for the track to wander, and every 6-hourly bulletin from here will narrow the cone a little further. The Hong Kong Observatory moved on Friday evening. At 20:40 Hong Kong time, that is 12:40 our universal time, it issued the standby signal number 1, the first stage of its tropical cyclone warning system, with Kiyapo still some 800 kilometres away. The observatory said the signal would stay up at least until noon on Saturday, and that it may consider raising the number 3 signal for strong winds on Saturday afternoon as the storm closes in. For a city of more than 7 million people, that first signal is the starting gun. It is when ferry operators, construction sites, schools, and the airport begin working through their storm procedures long before the wind actually arrives. Across the border, China's forecasters were moving too. The National Meteorological Center had tropical cyclone warnings up for the Guangdong and Fujian coasts, bracing for a weekend landfall and the rain that comes with it. This is the machinery of a region that has learned to live with typhoons, a chain of agencies, each responsible for its own stretch of coast, all reading the same storm and issuing in sequence as it approaches. Manila hands the storm to Taipei's watch, Taipei to Hong Kong and Beijing, and each one raises its own warnings on its own timetable. What they are collectively telling more than 80 million people along the Guangdong coast is simple. A typhoon is coming this weekend. The Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Dongguan, Foshan, Zhuhai, Hong Kong and Macau is one of the most densely built coastlines anywhere on Earth, a wall of high-rise cities and ports right at the water's edge. Even a mid-strength typhoon into that coast is a major event because there is so much in the way. That is the exposure sitting under this forecast, and it is why the region is not waiting to see the final numbers before it starts getting ready. To understand why forecasters keep warning that Kiyapo could be stronger than its lower forecasts suggest, you have to look at what is happening to the whole Pacific this year. The driver is the 2026 El Niño. Noul's main index for the eastern Pacific sat at plus 0.98 degrees Celsius for the April to June season, firmly in El Niño territory after one of the fastest swings ever recorded, climbing about 1.5 degrees in roughly 6 months. It arrived on top of the warmest ocean surface June ever measured. Forecasters are now watching whether it strengthens into a so-called Super El Niño, which would put it in the company of the great events of 1997 and 2015. El Niño does something specific to the world's storm basins. It pulls them in opposite directions. In the Atlantic, it strengthens the high-altitude winds that shred storms before they can organize, which is why the Atlantic has managed only 2 weak storms all season and is expected to stay quiet for weeks. In the West Pacific, it does the reverse. It gives storms longer runs over open, warm water and feeds them with ocean heat, and that tilts the entire season towards stronger, longer-lived typhoons. This is not a theory waiting to be tested. The proof is already on the board this year. Super Typhoon Sinlaku reached the top category in April, causing around $1.5 billion in damage and killing 17 people in the Mariana Islands region. Super Typhoon Bavi did it again in July, with winds near 290 kilometres per hour, its eye passing directly over the island of Rota in the Marianas. Both of those storms share a detail that should make everyone along the Guangdong coast pay attention. They outran their own forecasts. Both Sinlaku and Bavi grew stronger, faster than the early guidance predicted. The numbers on the official maps turned out to be too low. That is the pattern sitting directly behind Kiyapo, and it is why nobody is treating the bottom end of its forecast as a safe bet. The water ahead of it is 30 to 31 degrees Celsius, and beneath the surface, the warmth runs down far enough to keep feeding the storm even as it churns the sea. That is more than enough fuel to build a dangerous typhoon if Kiyapo gets the time over open water to use it. The clock, not the ceiling, is the thing to watch. The coastline Kiyapo is aimed at has been through this before, and the memories are recent enough to sting. In September 2018, Super Typhoon Mangkhut struck the Pearl River Delta and forced the Hong Kong Observatory to hold its highest warning, signal number 10, for about 10 hours, the second longest that top signal has flown since the Second World War. Mangkhut caused roughly 4.6 billion Hong Kong dollars in direct losses in the city alone, tore facades off towers, flooded low-lying districts, and did the worst widespread damage the territory had seen in 3 decades. A year earlier, in 2017, Typhoon Hato had battered the same stretch of coast and killed 9 people in Macau, where the storm surge pushed seawater far into the streets and left whole districts underwater. Those 2 storms are the region's yardstick for what a strong typhoon into this coast can do to it. There is a longer lesson here too, and it points straight back to the El Niño driving this season. The benchmark El Niño typhoon year is 1997, remembered across the region as the year of the Super Typhoon. That season produced 11 super typhoons and the highest single-season storm energy ever recorded in any basin. And at one point in October, 2 separate top-category storms churned across the Pacific at the same time. That year was the completed version of the pattern the Pacific is running again right now, a strong El Niño loading the West Pacific while it silenced the Atlantic. Kiyapo is one storm, and on its own it is very unlikely to be another Mangkhut. The honest read is that most guidance still points to a strong tropical storm, or a modest typhoon, not a monster. But it is arriving in a season that has already built 2 top-category storms and shown a habit of beating its own forecasts onto a coast that knows exactly what the worst version looks like. That combination is why the region is treating a storm still 2 days from land as seriously as it is. It is also why forecasters keep repeating the same advice along the delta. Prepare for the stronger end of the forecast and let the storm talk you back down rather than the other way around. The next day decides this story, and the signals to watch are clear. In Hong Kong, the observatory's own moves are the thing to follow. Whether it raises the number 3 signal on Saturday afternoon as expected, and whether it goes higher still as the storm's closest approach arrives late on Saturday into Sunday. In the Philippines, PAGASA's final bulletins confirm the storm is clear of the islands and let the far north begin counting the damage from the wind and the sea. And out over the South China Sea, the one question that has run through this entire forecast finally gets answered. How much of that 30-degree ocean heat Kiyapo converts before it reaches the coast, and whether the centre comes ashore east of the Pearl River Delta, as most guidance says, or edges west onto the delta itself. Landfall is expected early on Sunday, the 26th of July, somewhere on the Guangdong coast. Between now and then, the storm is crossing the warmest, most energy-loaded water on its whole route, which is exactly when these systems tend to surprise the forecasts. So watch the Hong Kong Observatory's next signal, watch PAGASA's exit bulletins, and watch the Guangdong coastal warnings from China's National Meteorological Center. For the tens of millions of people behind that coast, the difference between a strong storm and a dangerous typhoon is going to be written over the next 24 hours, out on an ocean that has already built 2 monsters this year. We will know very soon, and when the observatories update, we will bring you the numbers that matter.